Hello there. My name is Dr. Chiron Wesley Graves, and today I have with me Mr. Pickles. And in this video, we're going to tell the untold story of Mr. Pickles and the inheritance of Clown and Albino. Stay tuned. So as I mentioned in the intro, this is Mr. Pickles, and this video will highlight or will talk about his story of his inheritance of two traits that I talked about in the last video. That is the clown trait, which you can see in his stripe along his dorsal or his back. Very beautiful stripe. And then you can also see down the sides the teardropping that you may remember from the clown phenotype when I showed you Bingo. And he also has the albino trait, as you can see with his red eyes and his yellow color and lack of black and brown due to an absence of melanin produced by his melanocytes. Both of these traits, the clown trait and the albino trait, are recessive traits. And so we're going to talk about his inheritance of those two traits in this video. But to do that, we have to introduce you to his two parents, because he inherited those traits from his two parents. I'm back with Ahsoka. Remember, she was our example of the albino trait in the last video, and she is Mr. Pickles' mom. Now, one thing you'll notice is that they both have those beautiful yellow shades of yellow, and they both lack any brown or black pigment, right? A difference you'll see is in the patterns, and that's because Ahsoka doesn't have the clown phenotype. She has the albino phenotype, and so similar to her son, Mr. Pickles, but she does not have the clown phenotype. And yet he does. How is that possible? Well, let's check out his dad and see if we get an answer to that question. So I am back now with Mansa. Mansa is Mr. Pickles' father. Mansa does not have the albino phenotype. He doesn't have the clown phenotype either. He looks different from a wild type ball python, that's for sure. Let's go ahead and put Mr. Pickles back. Mansa clearly doesn't have the albino phenotype or the clown phenotype. So how does his son, Mr. Pickles, get it? Well, let's talk about that. Let's start off with a breakdown of the TYR gene. The TYR gene has 3 alleles that we'll talk about or that are of note. And I'll remind you that alleles are just different forms of the gene. So we can have what's called the wild type allele, and we'll call that a dominant allele because we only need one copy of that allele for the phenotype to show in the individual or in the ball python. And in our example here, we're going to use a capital T for tyrosine or TYR gene, in capital to denote that it is a dominant allele. You may recall that the product is tyrosinase. We'll actually say normal tyrosinase, normal function tyrosinase. Say that. And then the phenotype is, let's say, brown with black patterns or black pattern. The second TYR allele there that we'll talk about is the albino allele, which is a recessive allele. So that means 2 copies are needed for the phenotype to show. We'll use the symbol of a lowercase t with a superscript lowercase a. The product is no product, so no tyrosinase. And the phenotype is yellow with white pattern. And then lastly, or third, is, let's call it the candy allele. This is also a recessive allele. We're going to represent that with a lowercase t and a superscript lowercase c. And that is low activity, or the product is a low activity tyrosinase. So some melanin is made, but not the normal amount. So tyrosinase is not nearly as active. And we'll say the phenotype is yellow with lavender pattern. Now let's do a breakdown of the MC1R gene. There are 2 alleles for the MC1R gene that we're going to talk about. One is the wild type allele, and that allele is dominant. We're going to use M as the symbol for the MC1R gene, and so we'll use a capital M to denote the dominant or wild type allele. The product is let's say normal function MC1R, and the phenotype is regular black pattern. And then let's use this orange for the clown allele, which is a recessive allele. So 2 copies of the clown allele are necessary for the clown phenotype. Actually, let's do something else here. So let's say wild type we're going to use a lowercase m to represent the clown allele. Let's say altered function MC1R is the product, and it results in irregular brown. Let's put this on the brown pattern. Or clown phenotype. Now let's talk about the genotype and phenotype for each gene for each parent. So the genotype is simply a combination of 2 alleles for a gene. And so let's start by looking at the genotype and phenotype for the TYR gene. In Ahsoka, the phenotype for the TYR gene is the phenotype that leads to an albino phenotype. No tyrosinase. And her genotype for the TYR gene, remember she needs 2 copies of the albino allele to have the albino phenotype. Let's stick with TYR for now and then talk about Mansa's phenotype for that gene, which we'll call wild type. And Mansa has a dominant allele or wild type allele and an albino allele. And something I didn't mention before is the term heterozygous. So Mansa has a heterozygous genotype for the TYR gene. That means he has 2 different alleles for the TYR gene. And Ahsoka has a homozygous recessive genotype. It means both of her alleles are the same and they both are recessive for this gene. Now let's talk about the MC1R gene. And as it relates to this gene, Ahsoka would be considered a wild type. She has a dominant allele and a recessive or clown allele. And so that makes her heterozygous for the MC1R gene. And then Mansa also wild type. He does not have the recessive phenotype. He has the dominant phenotype. You know what? Maybe it is good if we did add those little details in there just to remind us. And for the TYR, this is a recessive. Mansa is also heterozygous for the MC1R gene as well. Now let's talk about gamete formation in both Ahsoka and Mansa. Gametes are the reproductive cells of an organism. The female gametes are called egg cells. So Ahsoka's making egg cells. The male gametes are called sperm. And so Ahsoka, based on her, based on her two different genotypes. So remember, this one is the genotype for the TYR gene. And then this one is the genotype for the MC1R gene. So whenever she's making her egg cells, and that's done through a process called meiosis, I won't go into detail here. I'll just mention it briefly. I'm including resources where you can learn more about this process and other processes that create the cells. So we'll just keep it simple here. For every one of her gametes that she creates, she has the possibility of this copy. And actually, since both of her copies, since she's homozygous for the TYR gene, then there's really only one copy that she can pass on, right? The albino allele. But she can pass on either the wild type allele for the MC1R gene. So that's one possibility for a gamete. And then the other possible gamete is the clown allele. So let's label this gamete number 1. And this one number 2. For Mansa, we have 4 possibilities. So we have the possibility, thought I changed this, of the wild type allele for the TYR gene and the wild type allele for the MC1R gene. So that's one possibility. We have the possibility of the wild type we have the possibility of the wild type TYR gene, or wild type TYR allele, I should say, and the clown allele for the MC1R gene. So that's 2. We have the possibility of the albino allele for TYR combining with the wild type allele for MC1R. And then we have the albino allele for TYR combining with the clown allele for MC1R. And so this was 3 and this is 4. So those are the 4 possible combinations of alleles for these 2 genes. Let's finish off the video by talking about the possible offspring that Ahsoka and Mansa can produce via the possible combinations of their gametes, or fertilization of Ahsoka's 2 possible eggs with Mansa's 4 possible sperm combinations. So we have the possibility of this egg cell and let's call it egg cell number 1 and sperm cell or sperm number 1. Those 2, when they come together, would make an offspring with the genotype of a heterozygous genotype for the TYR gene and a homozygous dominant genotype for the MC1R gene, and that individual would have a wild type phenotype. So that's possibility number 1. Possibility number 2 is egg cell number 1 being fertilized by sperm cell number 2. And in the event that happened, we would get a heterozygous genotype for the TYR gene and a heterozygous genotype for the MC1R gene. And that individual would have a wild type phenotype. Possibility 3 is egg cell 1 and sperm 3 And that individual would have a homozygous recessive genotype for the TYR gene and a homozygous dominant genotype for the MC1R gene, and that individual would have an albino phenotype. Fourth possibility is the combination of egg cell number 1 and sperm cell or sperm number 4. And that individual would have a homozygous recessive genotype for the TYR gene and a heterozygous genotype for the MC1R gene, and that individual would have an albino phenotype. Continuing with possibility number 5, that would involve egg cell number 2 combining with sperm number 1. And if that were to happen, then we would have an individual with a heterozygous TYR genotype and a heterozygous MC1R genotype. And that individual would be or would have a wild type phenotype. It's also possible, the 6th possibility, egg cell number 2 and sperm cell number 2 coming together would make an individual with a heterozygous genotype for TYR and a homozygous recessive genotype for MC1R. And this individual would have a clown phenotype. A 7th possibility is the combination of egg cell number 2 and sperm cell number 3. And if that fertilization were to happen, then we'd have an individual with a homozygous recessive genotype for albino and for the TYR gene, and a heterozygous genotype for the MC1R gene. And that individual would have an albino phenotype. And lastly, the egg cell number 2 being fertilized by sperm number 4, which would give us an individual with both a a homozygous recessive genotype for TYR, and a homozygous genotype for MC1R. In that individual, is the individual we see in Mr. Pickles. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, is the story of Mr. Pickles and his inheritance of both the albino and clown traits. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video and you learned something along the way. If so, make sure you hit that like button. Be sure to subscribe. And until next time, have a good one.